Hello everyone, today we talk about the county of Toulouse. Right, in Occitan, Comtat de Toulouse was a territory, as you know, in Occitania, southern France, today's southern France, consisting of the city of Toulouse and its district, ruled in fact by the Count of Toulouse from the late 19th century approximately until the 13th, right, late 13th. And the territory by itself is the center of Occitanian culture, right, broadly meant as this important, as we will see now, properly urban center, right, which in southern Europe we've seen many times was still effectively the real center of political and social life throughout all the early Middle Ages, right? And that also presents, as we'll see, some even communal development and, in fact, self-government for that matter, and also the persistence of certain, in fact, more Romanized customs also in their legal constitutions and so on. And we will see how it was born in the first place. Now, under the Carolingians, the counts and dukes were appointed by the royal court. So when we speak of counties in this broader sense, they date back to roughly Frankish times. There were comital powers also in the late Roman Empire in this area of Gaul. Such tradition would essentially continue on without many perceivable breaks, right, from that late antique culture into the heart of the Middle Ages, right? And the comital title, as we will see, would become hereditary over time, instead in the broader feudalization of these lands that were quite fragmented in the first place. And the first characteristic when thinking about southern France in this picture is the following: that is to say, the south was consistently richer per capita and thus more politically parceled, right, into various centers, so that the county of Toulouse at the end of the day would succumb instead to the north that was, if you want, less developed at some, especially broader cultural terms. Think about the great Occitanian artistic tradition, the literary one, musical one, etc. But it was more military oriented, right? It had fewer people at the top of the feudal hierarchy that would control a great amount of resources that were all functional to the existence of a professional military elite, right? That would operate a sort of imperial policy over the surrounding regions. It is what the Franks had done since their blending with Gallo-Roman society in the north and extending their power around these other realities that, as we'll see now, were governed by other Germanic peoples, but were also, in fact, some most deeply Romanized in absolute terms. And the revival of this power in northern power would occur gradually, much later, in fact, in the 13th century, from which these two areas, the Languedoc and the Languedoc, would be, in fact, separated, right, by centuries of different developments, of different exposures, properly to different cultures, and would be essentially two different countries. So that what we see of France today, actually, it's two big chunks, right, the northern and southern one, of which Toulouse, as we've seen, is the most representative in terms of Occitanian culture that was eventually gradually absorbed and modified and diluted into the French one that imposed, that degree of statutal uniformity. Properly, the French today is Languedoc, right, as the north imposes on the other countries, like in Spain it's Castilian, in Britain it's English, etc. And the counts of Toulouse, however, have, as we were saying before, this continuity properly within the same city, right, in its surrounding district, in this long period that goes from, in fact, Carolingian times until 1271. And at times, the counts of Toulouse and their family members would be also counts of Quercy, Rouergue, Albi, Nîmes, Provence, and Marquesas of Gothia as well, right? So they entertained definitely relations with lots of other countries. The other day we were making that video on the Crown of Aragon. There were ties with this broader trans-Pyrenean reality created, in fact, as the Mark of Spain that encompassed both, actually, the lands from both watersheds of the mountains as a frontier area, and they had a lot in common, especially the Mediterranean coastal connection. It's also important to stress here the difference between certain areas of this, because as we'll see now, the south here encompasses different sub-regions. One is Aquitaine, the Atlantic watershed, with the cities of Bordeaux, of Tours, up to north to Loire, that were historically something else, and actually, even though they were more Romanized than the north, actually less Romanized than this other stripe that in the ancient world was known as Septimania, essentially between the Rhone and the Pyrenees along the Mediterranean coast. It was so called because it could be crossed in a week, apparently, and that would take instead the name of Gothia in early medieval times, because this would be essentially the last land strip that the Visigoths maintained after they had been ousted of Gaul, except for this line, in fact, by the Franks after the Battle of Vouillé, and in fact was factually, yes, I mean, something different. The Visigothic kingdom was something complex, territorially speaking. It had troubles to remain like as a unique thing, right? And there were different chunks, right? The Iberian Plateau, then the Ebro Valley, the south, the very south, and Gothia itself in this essentially Gallic reality. Then there were other very important and rich and deeply Romanized lands in Provence, right? That instead stands essentially east of the Rhone river, and that is at least its most in fact distinct part, its most unitary part in as Provence proper, and that were separated from the area ruled by Toulouse, right? That is also, as we will see, not really a compact entity in turn, because of the aforementioned more equal and important distribution of wealth in this Mediterranean cities that would go like as somewhat autonomously, as independent, right? Properly from any power, factually, right? Because this belonged since Carolingian times and formally to the kingdom of the Western Franks, but before the North recompacted under a solid monarchy and managed to get again to reassert its power in the South, would take effectively 4 centuries, right? So that's why things went differently, and therefore it was a very blurred situation at some levels. There was a superimposition of the county that was a feudal institution, and the commune that was instead the government of the city people. We'll see it better, but it's properly important to understand how this intermittent control from the Frankish north occurred in the area, and how this molded together with the pre-existing culture and development this specific realities. So, as we were saying before, the Roman province of what had been essentially the Gallia Narbonensis, right, is a bit larger than here what the county of Toulouse was, and encompassed right fundamentally up to Italy. In following the coast, had fallen, however, to the Visigothic kingdom in the 5th century, when the Visigoths had been settled as federati, etc. And Septimania was this Visigothic province, roughly corresponded to the later county of Toulouse. If you look at the extension, its control, its power, Toulouse had detached fundamentally itself from the broader Aquitainian area to which especially in Frankish times had outlined itself separately from Gothia, in fact. And this area would even fall briefly in the 50s of the 8th century to the Emirate of Cordoba, right, before it was conquered into the kingdom of the Franks by Pippin the Short in 759 after the siege of Narbonne. So it's at that point, under renewed Frankish control, actually properly affirmed, because as we were saying before, the Franks had never quite directly controlled that area and would always have trouble, to maintain it as a decentralized power, as Gothia or Marca Gothica in Latin. By the end of the 9th century, where the big pieces of cake of the broader Carolingian kingdom now had cooled down and been separated and kind of enucleated. After the floating nature that they had, literally the Carolingians, as you know, properly drew certain boundaries that wouldn't exist before, and that naturally overlapped with important cultural or ethnic repercussions, but had never to be given quite for granted because they were feudal in nature, right? So they tried to naturally exploit the previous local identities and costumes and organizational convenience, but they could have also been different. Now, during the joint reign of Carloman and Charlemagne, followed to the death of their father Pippin in 768, as it would be normally in Frankish reality, where, as I've seen, the kingdom was fundamentally split at every generation with their male sons, with disastrous consequences independently of any other consistency of power. In fact, the southern lands rebelled against Frankish rule when Hunald II was the Duke of Aquitaine from 768, raised an insurrection, in fact, against the Frankish power in Aquitaine proper. Aquitaine proper had, aside from now our Gothic, if we can call it, interests, but it's part of the same thing, that's why it's important, was kind of a country on its own within the broader, it was among the, as a Teilreich of the Frankish Empire, right? It was one of those lands that were not inhabited, were barely settled by any Frank, aside from some elite that married into the local one. Historically, right, such as happened in Burgundy, in Alemannia, etc. And Aquitaine had maintained this distinct and more Romanized character as a kind of its own. It was very important. It was very big. This was effectively the main center of southwestern Gallic power that tried to escape with more consistency, with more capacity, also militarily, politically speaking, the Frankish orbit. Right, these areas had fundamentally had re-entered in early Carolingian times under the Frankish orbit, simply because they had been destroyed, had been wiped out in a sense, or weakened so much during the 732 and previous years invasion of Aquitaine by the Muslims, right? So that the Franks at that point intervened actually to seize it, but with political logic that we've seen also in other videos, that was literally, this was another country. It had nothing to do with the Franks, it had nothing to do with the Moors, it was just another country wanted to be on its own. And instead, the Franks took advantage of the Muslim invasion to conquer it on their own. And in previous times, in fact, Aquitanian allegiance was, of course, religion barely mattered anything in international politics. They preferred to side with the Muslims more often than not, than to fall under the much closer and consistently more aggressive Franks from that side of the border, let's say. And as a consequence, in this rebellion, 768-69, Charlemagne intervened and defeated Hunald, right? And in 771, Carloman died, fortunately for Charlemagne, and in a sense for us, because he had not died, we wouldn't have had a Carolingian Empire. If a Carolingian Empire exists, it depended decisively on these aspects, right? Whether these sons was fortunate enough to have all their brothers dead, right, and therefore not contending continuously with continuous prolonged warfare, their power and weakening the world system. This happened to Charlemagne, happened to Louis the Pious, and guess what happened with the descendants of Louis the Pious, as we will remember again. End of the Carolingian Empire, factually, after, basically a couple of generations. And so, naturally, Charlemagne consolidated massively Frankish power. It created, as we were just saying, the empire what we really know in its unitary and enormous and incredibly powerful fashion that had not been seen in Western Europe since the time of the Roman Empire. And he led an important amount of expeditions, as you know, against the Arabs of Spain. So that this broader area of southern Gaul, and especially the one around the county of Toulouse, and that enters, along the Mediterranean coast, most of it, passing the Pyrenees by side and entering in Spain, and in areas that are very urbanized, very Romanized, very rich. So there are areas that also can be controlled by such a privatized and decentralized power like the Frankish one of the north. Instead, a very important opportunity to have a functional government in a settled fashion, right, were of enormous strategical relevance, right, but they were distant, right. So at this point, the Franks could effectively keep these lands together by deterrence, given that the Franks basically did only one thing in their history: war, right? And at this point, the Carolingians had systematized the Frankish army in an excellent military machine that would operate every single year. Big news in the annals is not what the campaign factually was, but whether, that year a campaign had not happened for some reason. There were also multiple campaigns in a year. Charlemagne was a great logistician, a great organizer. He carried out this massive operations, such as the ones that, the joint one, the Pippin one that would conquer the kingdom of Italy, besieging its capital of Pavia for 9 months. It is something that, at that time you never find, like a siege would never last 9 months. It was a massive, enormous force supplies. Also the enormous logistical preparation for the invasion of the remains of the Avar Khaganate along the Danube. It's another astonishing enterprise, for not speaking of the constant hammering and subjugation of Saxony that went on for decades and that achieved the complete subjugation and integration in a functional way of that land in the Carolingian Empire, completing the conquest of Germany, where not even the Romans previously had managed to achieve. Well, this southern area was paradoxically more complicated, right? After all, the other conquests of Saxony, of other southern German lands, of Italy, were much more secure in a sense for different reasons, mostly due to the lack of very powerful elites and some more evenly, wealth distribution, but also certain specific political balances in the area. Here, situation was more complicated because from one side you had to cross all Gaul to get there in the first place. These lands were already quite with autonomistic tendencies on their own. So when the campaign was over, the Franks would come back north, and even after having left their garrisons, their counts, their control, they could easily, in a sense, have switch allegiances, right? There were the Muslims from the other side. There were the Basques that left of the on the left bank of the Garonne south towards the Pyrenees and beyond, were always this pain in the side that would bring famously enough the famous battle of Roncesvalles in French, where Charlemagne's rearguard was annihilated in the past, right, by Basque troops that eventually chivalric tradition in Europe would make actually Moors, Muslims, but they were actually these southwestern European populations that were quite fiercely jealous of their independence, and were also quite insensitive by reasons of development properly to certain aspects of the broader Frankish culture. And that made the same Charlemagne understand that this wall area altogether was, so between Gascony and Aquitaine, fundamentally, was still in feeble control of the Franks, right? And therefore some greater control had to be established. So the whole region was re-administered fundamentally by Charlemagne, who imposed Frankish counts in the key cities. That already tells you what was properly the place from which in these regions power exists, right? Then in the north, the great holdings were rural, right? The Frankish kings had lived mostly in this great country mansions, right? With with a very different reality from the south. Was much more urbanized. The north was about cattle. It was about more. There was the world of the forest as well, right? In France, in Germany, where this communities sometimes properly detached from the city. There were cities as well. Importantly enough, the same Carolingian north was Carolingian power in the north was centered in the cities, right? Gaul, after all, was the real center of Frankish power since Clovis times, and this because it was effectively rich, advanced, urbanized compared to Germany, the Austrasian lands especially, from which even the same Carolingians had stemmed. So that tells you a lot. And one of these key cities in the south was Toulouse. That was arguably, at least in the Mediterranean watershed, definitely the most important. Now, in 781, Charlemagne also set up the Kingdom of Aquitaine that encompassed the whole region, including Gascony, by the way, up to the Mediterranean coast with Narbonne, Nîmes. So this area of Gothia from the Mediterranean side, right? And he entrusted, gave the crown of Aquitaine to at that time his 3-year-old son Louis, that would be Louis the Pious. And this was a way of compartmentalizing power. So say, my son will go there, so that he would habituate. That was a great problem of succession, right? How can we keep this thing together without essentially splitting from a day to another? Let's habituate the idea that there are some spheres of influences and so on. Similar policies would be carried out in other areas of Europe, as you understand. And so from the county or duchy, because the title was also fluctuating at this point, right? There isn't a rigidly determined lexicon, what define of institutional format that is just the county or the duchy. It depended, right? It was a floating title. The county was kind of the standard Frankish district that established since Clovis times. The comites were in this sense much warlike, a bit like the dukes, but in Carolingian times this difference would increase because the territory control was larger, so it would be more evident whether a frontier post would be more kind of military biased. We have seen it also in that video we made on the Duchy of Burgundy, that it was called like that because of this frontier areas, and fundamentally, but even there, county or duchy, also in Brittany. And the county duchy of Toulouse was designed, in this sense, to supervise the Basque frontier, especially in the west, if you look at Toulouse on the map. Charlemagne had entrusted power to Corson, in this sense, the Comes or Dukes of Toulouse. And the Basques were not happy of this, so much that he was actually captured. They captured Corson himself in 787 or 789, right? And forced this Carolingian official to consider such a shameful agreement that Charlemagne replaced him with Count William in 709. Right. It's important to stress that in the Frankish political vision, in theory, all these territories at large, the whole empire, is a private possession of the dynasty. Right. This is something that only the Franks factually did at this point. This is also probably what the aristocratic model of Europe would emerge gradually by the broader process of Frankization of Europe. That these counties are just districts fundamentally that thus can ideally be where you can appoint ideally just one guide and taking it away if you don't like it, because it's your property, you can do whatever you want. But the reality of all this is that naturally during even the heyday of the Carolingian Empire, the problem was to really control these individuals, because on such an enormous space, the only way actually to win their own loyalty and to make them thus functional vassals at the end of the day was just to provide the military clientele through the local resources of territory for the big army, was to entrust them, in fact, to this prepaid, in fact, amount of land that was factually their own at that point, controlled from it. So from there, the practice of naturally passing down this property from generation to the other would be the trend that eventually would sanction one of the major aspects of feudalism. That is, if the king can do that with his own kingdom, well, why shouldn't I do it with my own family at the same time? Because at the end of the day, the ethos, the morals were the same, right? And that's the reason why also the empire fell, because there was no other consistent public or subtle centralized glue that could keep this thing together, but this private clientele, right? And even if Charlemagne or Louis the Pious made a great effort, especially through the help of the church, to concentrate more power, in the hands of the sovereigns, the thing, as you know, would crumble, right? So Toulouse, however, in this phase, what became the at least a major military stronghold from which campaigns against the Muslim Spain were launched, right? Almost every year during Charlemagne's reign, right? Barcelona was conquered in 801, as well as a large part of Catalonia as well. And together with the northern areas of Aragon and Navarre along the Pyrenees, right, these territories became part of the southern march, the Spanish march of the Frankish Empire, which would, in a sense, connect them, as we've seen before, also between this various nobility. Now it was being appointed at their control, and that came to be entrenched in this lands that, as we've seen, were already provided with essentially a degree of autonomy, right? Even the Emirate of Cordoba, the great splendor of its wealth and power, that was really a centralized state, just like the Byzantine Empire, nothing like the Latin Germanic world. Was actually quite fragmented towards the northern frontier, right? That were all different emirs that would control the various cities in and remain just like under Visigothic times, right? In the same regions. This continuity of autonomization was always in the same places, right? The same dynamics. There wasn't much could change, even with different rulers. So when Charlemagne died, Louis the Pious, that had been, as we've seen, King of Aquitaine, became emperor, and the kingdom was transmitted to Pippin, the second son of Louis the Pious. At this point, Gothia was detached from the kingdom of Aquitaine, and importantly so, was administered directly by the emperor, right? So this is particularly relevant because it makes you understand how strategically important this land was. It was effectively the channel from between Spain and Gaul, right? The emperors wanted to control it directly, whereas the Duchy of Aquitaine was more of an Atlantic thing, right? Even more easily to reach in a sense, naturally, than given that it stretched mostly in latitudinally, right, and that was bordering with Neustria, right, so it was more controllable in a sense. And as we've seen, Gothia was also a militarized area, was a frontier area, had a strategic meaning, it had important infrastructure, cities with Roman walls, with that important infrastructural base. Well, as you know, Louis the Pious had 3 sons, right, and he reallocated his future inheritance of the empire to them. Now, Pippin was confirmed king in Aquitaine. As you know, Louis the German took... At that point, there were different divisions, actually, so originally things would go differently with the wars between these brothers, but initially it was Bavaria for him. Lothair would receive the most important area, essentially, of this strip between the Alps and the North Sea, and more importantly, the Kingdom of Italy, to which the Imperial title was connected. That would be the major ruler, and as you know, especially the Lotharingian never as such never quite survived as north of the Alps as a unitary, as a consistent reality politically. In 823, Charles the Bald, that was son to to the second wife of Louis the Pious, and therefore half brother of the other Louis the German and Lothair, right? Where struggle. He was born, right, first of all in 823, and then, as you know, his mother worked a lot to carve for him some special power. Things are, we would go too much in detail here, but the important thing is that the struggles that emerged eventually between the brothers brought already from the end of the reign of Louis the Pious to this chronic instability, for which effectively the empire, until Charles the Fat at the late 9th century, would never be reunified as such. And Charles the Bald was in this process appointed as new king of Aquitaine, right? And later on in 839, he also was provided with the entirety of the western half of the empire, so what would become effectively the Western Frankish Kingdom, so encompassing all these territories that would thus make, up to the very south of Gothia, etc., this what we call eventually as the Kingdom of France, right, for which eventually the French kings would claim rights on the southern lands, that albeit having remained attached from centuries and never, as we've seen, having been quite culturally part of the same country, we can say. And so, the rest of the divisions of the empire, I re-uploaded a bit about them just recently. However, Pippin II of Aquitaine, the son of Pippin I, was not going to accept this new agreement, right? Because his uncle Charles the Bald at that point would have been in charge of the Wall territories, that at that point there, in terms of kingship, would have been somewhat independent from other realms within the empire, right? Instead, the Western Frankish one now encompassed the whole area of Aquitaine, of the southern Gaul, etc. So he was actually hailed king by the Aquitanians, not by the Basques, that were always very, on their own. They had basically seceded and detached Vasconia from Aquitaine, right, in the escaping here with this centrifugal push, reverting to factual independence. And he took up arms and resisted, first actually his grandfather, because Louis the Pious was still alive in this period, and he died in 840. So at this point, there was that atrocious and final showdown between his various sons that would bring to the bath of blood of Fontenoy, then in August 843, the Treaty of Verdun, that effectively splits the Carolingian Empire into the major chunks that more or less the post-Carolingian kingdoms like France, Germany, and Italy. And thus the Western Frankish chunk was reaffirmed as properly Charles the Bald dominion, right, and royal title, right, Francia Occidentalis, Western Frank land, so to be called France in some century. Now, as a consequence, Charles the Bald secured, or at least started, securing, his own kingdom, moving south to defeat Pippin II, because as we've seen, Aquitaine was a pretty big chunk of this world territorial reality. It was effectively bordering the core land of Neustria, and it was a looming threat, right? It's as if it had been effectively a competitor, a royal competitor against the same Western Frankish king within his own territory. And interestingly enough, Charles the Bald first conquered Gothia, because the local count had rebelled, and it already tells you how strategically important the place was, but also how autonomous it was. Charles the Bald had him executed, right? So, because the story here, as long as the Carolingians started killing each other, as the Franks usually did for the aforementioned reasons all the time, they autonomized, right? And so in 844, actually the same Toulouse that was the capital, had been the capital of King Pippin II of Aquitaine, was besieged, right? However, the Saint Charles the Bald was to withdraw in front of the city walls, because the city was too much of a bite to swallow. And this tells you how important, properly the center was, even infrastructurally and strategically and so on. Since, things can always get worse, the Vikings that had spread their piracy far and wide in an ever bolder fashion, given they were observing the Carolingians essentially crushing, each other, and even using the same Vikings, throwing like them at one another, like the Saint Charles the Bald did with Louis the German, etc. Actually entered the mouth of the Garonne River, took Bordeaux, so as we see a major city in Aquitaine, sailed up as far as Toulouse, right? These were really the two most important centers, right? Toulouse, the most important one, even the Bordeaux, right? But they had been kind of detached also because Aquitanian power tended to get, for strategic reasons, more from the Atlantic side to counter that Neustrian threat rather than in the south. And they plundered and killed along all the river valley. It was a freaking mess, right? And also, they moved back when they reached Toulouse without attacking the city, because, again, if the Franks hadn't managed to besiege them at that point, nor the Vikings realistically could. And so we don't know what happened, however, because the reason is political. And it's been suggested the same Pippin II at that point would have called the Vikings in his own aid, or rather, to against Charles the Bald, in fact, as the same Charles propaganda would claim later, let's say, to damage at that point Charles the Bald's strategical advantage, right? However, it's also really possible that there wasn't. I mean, it's all true. It just depends on by which margin. It was just the fact that nobody could effectively stop the Vikings at that point in the area. But at least somebody told him, but if you go against that guy, maybe you make me a favor, I can give you something in return, right? And surely Toulouse was very well defended, as we've seen. So in any case, the city could hardly fall against such if you want, extemporary expeditions. In 845, Charles the Bald was obliged fundamentally to recognize Pippin II as King of Aquitaine by treaty. In exchange for him, however, to relinquishing the northern part of Aquitaine, that is the county of Poitiers de Poitou, right, to Charles the Bald, which would have been an important foothold of Neustrian power south of the Loire, right, so into Aquitanian territory. And Pippin II wasn't probably faring that well at that point for accepting that treaty as well, right? Here we're just assisting to the exhaustion of Frankish territories after this prolonged struggle, so much that their rulers couldn't quite. The whole situation is crumbling, right? There is a dramatic privatization, autonomization of power. These rulers are losing the grip consistently on their territory, and they understand also that there must be a settlement at some point. However, the Aquitanians were quite unhappy about Pippin II for some reason or another, right? It does sound saying because he had called the Vikings, but even just the fact that he was to give an amount of territory to Charles the Bald in exchange for the recognition of his title is not a great, indicator of political stability. And in fact, the same Aquitanians called Charles the Bald in 849, and who arrived up to Toulouse, in fact, when he received Frédéléon, the Count of the city, recently appointed by Pippin II, that by being confirmed by the Western Frankish Kingdom, fundamentally asserted the latter's control on Aquitaine, nominally, right? While Pippin II, 3 years later, was made prisoner by the Basques and handed over to his uncle, Charles, who relegated him in a monastery. It was the practice for knocking out, politically speaking. So this tells you how messed up the situation already was in the area, right? In fight between the Franks, essentially detachment of local power, such as even the County of Toulouse, that starts doing whatever they want and has an enormous prestige already, as we've seen. Basically, they are the ones that effectively can open the gates of Aquitaine in terms of broader penetration to Carolingian power. There are Vikings who raid around and make ferocious structural damage to the land. There are the Basques that roam around, that kidnap, Carolingians and sell them to one another during their feuds. So definitely not a great period of stability. And when Frédéléon died, the new Count of Toulouse was his brother Raymond, appointed by Charles the Bald himself, right? And it was a special favor because normally counts were administrative agents, were not necessarily chosen in the same family. However, this is the point, that privatization, decentralization, and hereditary couldn't be quite stopped. There was no effective territorial control those distances, and with Raymond I of Toulouse, Raymond I begins the dynasty of the Counts of Toulouse, right, in the broader historical, and up to very late. In fact, they would all be descended from him. And in 855, following the example of Charlemagne, his grandfather, Charles the Bald recreated the kingdom of Aquitaine, again without Gothia, right, and gave the crown to his son Charles the Child. That we think the child is because they died all in infancy, fundamentally, or under age. And in the meanwhile, Pippin II had escaped from a monastery and led an insurrection in Aquitaine again. So you understand here the broader level of instability, of permeability, of this guy could escape from exile and come back to Aquitaine and raise again an insurrection against the established. So it was really not much of a fortunate enterprise, but the fact that it could happen in the first place is meaningful. In fact, he called at this point for certain the Vikings for help, right? So making things worse than necessary in a sense. And at the head of the same Viking army, Pippin II in 864 besieged Toulouse, right? And the count of the city resisted. Firstly, the siege failed again. The Vikings obviously were not content, so they started plundering other areas of Aquitaine just for, so basically Pippin II is the asshole of the situation, and in fact he was abandoned by literally everybody, and he was captured again, put in a monastery again by his uncle Charles, and at this point he died soon afterwards, which was, the guy maybe died of displacing. They would consistently take him out. It's just we don't know that for sure. Also in 866, Charles the Child died. So his father appointed his other son, Louis the Stammerer, as the new king of Aquitaine. And this wouldn't stop any of the degradation of public authority in the area. And the Vikings were keeping to ravage Gaul, right? It was definitely their favorite target by this time, to put all the major French rivers and this fat cities and countryside left open to insurrection. The same to loot, and the same Frankish counts actually siding with them sometimes. This paradoxically reinforced a little bit and ensured the survival of the Western Frankish kingdom in itself, right? That at that point could have simply evaporated, just like others, at least in concrete power, would actually do. And as a consequence, the local vassals also took matters in their own hands, began to essentially usurp or take over those public prerogatives, such as the maintenance also of the local military. Bishops had a great importance in this, especially because they were located, set in the cities. They had important properties on their own. There is the broader process of consolidation. We made a video about this, and about properly Charles the Bold and his issues for saying, the situation is out of control. There are people who were building castles everywhere from which they are essentially challenging public authority, but it was completely out of his own control, right? It was just nominal effort because, those public royal authorities were being usurped, but it was in this total mess, nothing that could really reverse the process at that point. And thus, this thing, as went on as a broader phenomenon. Second invasions wouldn't be over until the 10th century, or even beyond a little bit. And in 877, Charles the Bold signed the very famous Capituli of Quercy-sur-Loise, which allowed counts to be succeeded by their sons when they died. So it's essentially the hereditarity of the major fiefs, right? Eventually, Conrad the Salient would accept even the one from smaller ones, but this is a milestone in Western feudalism, because it basically said that it was legal at that point to simply inherit, like dynastically, your father's possessions, as with all the attached prerogatives, and this would, in fact, with much of which European nobility and aristocracy in feudal era would be, defined by in many ways. And the new king of France was Louis the Stammerer after Charles' death a few months later. And he wouldn't choose actually a new king of Aquitaine. In fact, the entity as such disappeared, was never revived again. Right? This happened. We have seen also in other contexts that these were just contingent political creations, just to ensure maybe some some continuity between your power and one of your sons in these areas, if they would recognize them, etc. But the kingdom of Aquitaine died there. Nobody would revive it again. Also, Louis the Stammerer died after 879, quite soon, succeeded by his two sons Louis III and Carloman. Louis III inherited northwest France, Carloman Burgundy and Aquitaine, so essentially the north and the south respectively. But at this point, you can't even properly speak of any factual control from the side of the two, right? And especially the counts of southern France would achieve complete autonomy, right? And this trend would go on fundamentally up to the 13th century, without almost as if these two countries had nothing to do with each other anymore, right? Obviously, there were important intersections and interests, etc., but properly not for the northern French to reassert any concrete power in the south for centuries. So the county of Toulouse in the process had become an autonomous power, right, ruled by the dynasty, as we've seen, founded by Fred de Leon, who in theory was still a vassal of the Western Frankish king, but practically could govern the land quite, independent, right? And this was hard to do in the first place because as authorities, our lordship ceases, still, there are lots of other competing powers around. For example, the dynasty of the Counts of Auvergne, ruling the northeast continental part of the former Aquitaine, was also an important power, claiming the county of Toulouse as their own, right? And managing at some point to even oust the counts of Toulouse from their own city of Toulouse itself. They control also other centers, right? And they had other lands, so that's why this thing could go back and forth. And always remember that, yes, there is a count, but there are lots of other communities also within the city, right? There's nothing like properly a centralized comital power. Yes, especially at this moment, the metus hostilis, the needs of defense, etc., they would bring to an important militarization properly of power, in a sense, but with gradual, as we will see now, reawakening of economical or demographical growth, etc., after the end of the second invasions, or also in the meanwhile, by the way, things would gradually change, right? And the county of Toulouse, after all, in its dynasty, maintained their own unity. They ruled essentially a territory that now was essentially a small fraction of the former Aquitaine, the southeastern part of it. It wouldn't even arrive to the sea, right? Gothia at this point was not entirely under the control of the Counts of Toulouse. On the contrary, it had been under been a possession of the Counts of Auvergne, at least for 2 generations. However, after the death of William the Pious of Auvergne in 918, the Counts of Toulouse managed to expand in this area, right? So doubling their territory, so reuniting Toulouse with the Mediterranean coast and a very extended area, actually, from Narbonne to Nîmes. Right, so all the former Septimania, right? So the county of Toulouse took what would remain a sort of definite shape, in spite of eventually the internal, switches in power, right, depending on the flourishing of other centers, etc. But the county, as such, would acquire this specific physiognomy, right? And that is from Toulouse in the west to the Rhone River in the east. So with a markedly Mediterranean orientation, because Toulouse is, in the sense, is the western end. It could have expanded also from the other side, from the Atlantic watershed. No, it preferred Gothia because this area was much richer and much more advanced than Aquitaine on average, right? And this is to be reminded, because some people say treat this area often Aquitaine as such, because you see in late Rome, can be more complicated it seems, but in late Roman times, after Diocletian's administrative reform, the Narbonenses, so this broader area of in the Mediterranean watershed, had been connected to Aquitaine, right? So whatever went from the Loire river to the Mediterranean was conceived kind of unitarily. Actually, there were these distinctions, and these distinctions were not, and divisions were not random, right? Because Aquitaine was, yes, surely more Romanized, more Visigothic in nature than Neustria, but comparatively, properly, the Aquitanian areas is the Atlantic watershed was different from, in fact, a much more Romanized and in a sense Visigothized Gothia that Toulouse decides to expand on. Right, this is really important. Also because Toulouse in itself is as you know, if you have ever visited, I'd never visited, but I was about to go there, and an enormous storm was arriving exactly from it. Say maybe it's not quite the case, or okay, let's go back, and and it's a continental power. Right, it's not like properly a Mediterranean state. So it had that option, if you want, and it naturally always maintained an important strategical relevance also in this sometimes double orientation. It's just that the Mediterranean was more florid. It was less involved into the continental areas, where less developed in a sense, and also properly closer to competitive power. So by doing that, well, you could actually control the south. In fact, if you look at what the St. Counts of Auvergne did, Auvergne is another continental region historically, but they wanted to get to the Mediterranean. And also the French in the north would like to get to the Mediterranean, and they would by conquering these areas, but eventually in the 13th century, right? Because the northern world is another thing, right? And it is, especially in a specific way. For this reason, it's important to stress that Toulouse would never again be part of Aquitaine per se, right? Even if you look at the eventual, dynastic, you see, for example, the ones following the marriage of Eleanor of Aquitaine, first with Louis VII of France, and then Henry II of England. The border was quite close to Toulouse in the west, but all the Aquitanian part, eventually the English occupied part in some areas, this was still kind of a country in its own, of course, was one thing. This other would stick to, namely, to what was in a sense, also for reasons of political alignment, more the Western Frankish, the French side, albeit saying maybe that they were from the side of the French is maybe too much, just they wanted to be left autonomous on their own. But these contingencies were important because any power would try to seize naturally an emerging power with enough force would like to expand further its own control, and Toulouse was an important objective in a sense. Aquitaine would have as capitals eventually Poitiers, then Bordeaux again, and there was naturally a cultural connection, right, that is perceived in Toulouse, generally speaking. Count William de Pius of Auvergne had been the first one to create the title of Duke of Aquitaine for himself in the 90s of the 9th century. The Count of Poitiers inherited the title in 927. Right, so in 932, the king of Western Francia, Raoul, was fighting against the Count of Poitiers, right, and he transferred the title of Duke of Aquitaine to his new ally, who was Count Raymond the Third of Toulouse. So you see that in this regard there was kind of an affinity, even in interest, between the northern French and the Count of Toulouse, but it was just contingental because they were competing against the Duke of Aquitaine, right? But it wouldn't last much, also because practically that process of entrenchment, of encapsulation, of development of local seigneuries would take, again, a much greater diversion from this larger interactions again. So the Counts of Toulouse as the Dukes of Aquitaine, and it remained practically without any overlordship, ruling their territories on their own. And there were some changes in broader French policy that would bring to Raymond III of Toulouse in the opposite faction of Louis IV, that succeeded after Rose's death to the Western Frankish crown, and as a consequence, the same Louis IV in 950 titled William III of Poitiers Duke of Aquitaine. So the thing went from Toulouse again back to Aquitaine. In fact, that's how shortly it lasted. And in fact, from there on, the title of Duke of Aquitaine would be used in the family of the Counts of Poitiers. Nothing else, right? So you stuck just to Poitou, that is not even directly, bordering the county of Toulouse, and this would bring Aquitaine and Toulouse ever more apart, in a sense. So also we arrive to the times of the rise of the Robertians, the Counts of Paris, that would start effectively the Capetian royal line, with Hugh Capet securing the crown in 987 after the death of Louis V. And so that's how concretely any even employment of some Carolingian dynastic legacy was ended in Western France, right? And yet, the Counts of Paris from the Ile-de-France would take centuries before they could extend further up to reach the south of France again. The Count of Toulouse, in this process, as we've seen, took mostly a Mediterranean direction, right? But also tried to consolidate their own properly comital power within the same territory, right? The situation was difficult because, this was the moment of second invasions. So as we've seen, there is a lot of this local, of rebuilding from the bottom, right? From encapsulation, from securing some local control rather than, a floating power over different unreliable, unstable entities. And the area was still also attacked by, not just by the Vikings before, but by the Saracens later. Abd al-Rahman III of Cordoba not only managed to reunite Muslim Spain, bringing the emirate to its acme, but also transforming it into a caliphate, proper in 929. But in the same decade, properly launching offensives against the Christian kingdoms in the north of Spain that had survived the Muslim invasion since the 8th century, and interfering in this sense, as we've seen, had been a bit the same at the time of Poitiers, right? Certain patterns return, crossing the Pyrenees in the process and going as far north as Toulouse, right? And however, they would fail as well to capture the city. In 924, the Magyars, that were ravaging basically all the post-Carolingian kingdoms at this point, launched an expedition in the west as far as Toulouse, right? But they were defeated by Count Raymond III. This wasn't positive as a broader event to happen in the first place, but it surely shows the solidity of the county, if you want, in a moment of great crisis in all of Europe, in a sense. And you see how local powers managed to, put things together and resisting to such attacks. This is to be seen, in fact, basically anywhere, but still succeeding to stop even certain important incursions is meaningful, right? Especially if done in a repeated way since also the previous centuries. So the County of Toulouse, as such, became unavoidable also from a moral point of view, a point of reference in the area, right? As we've seen, Occitania had maintained more that cultural legacy that also was fueled paradoxically by this military engagements, in the sense that the land had never been disjointed in a broader sense by Spanish influence, whoever ruled in there, first the Visigoths, then the Moors. These were importantly advanced areas by early medieval standards. The Caliphate of Cordoba poured, science, manuscripts, knowledge from everywhere. People went studying there. There is, in the south of Gaul, specifically, this it's you can breathe it in the air, right? It's part of their culture. It's part of broader Occitania, in a sense. Some of the most gifted intellects of high medieval Europe were stemmed from these areas, being exposed to the scientific, the astronomic, mathematical knowledge brought by the Arabs, having their own local Christian educational system. They would develop a culture that would be at the base even of, think about Georges-Bertrand of Aurillac, Pope Sylvester saying he probably could create from the top of this culture the premises for the universalism of the Church of Rome, properly from a political, in terms of a political project and legacy, based on this great knowledge and this idea that, after all, Rome had to become a monarchy within the Western Church, not just one of the many, in spite of the primate of charity. There was this constant exposition also to the culture of the North at the same time, the proximity to Italy, and a connection also between Spain, in fact, and these areas where ecclesiastical policy, in fact, was quite important. There was the opening to the Mediterranean, to trade, right? Local people were more literate than the North. There were some, properly, society was more regulated legally. There was also an important Visigothic legacy that, as you know, was heavily Romanized, right? It was Visigothic and Roman law altogether properly. And with the Liber Judiciorum, codified in 642-643, expanded eventually by Visigothic King Regisbent in 653, there was a great freedom of women by early medieval standards. For example, they could inherit land and title, manage it independently from their husbands or other male relations, which was not quite the case. In France, it was not like that. In Italy, it was not like that. They at least formally, right, and they could dispose of their properties in legal wills, right, if they had no heirs. They could represent themselves and bear witness in court at the age of 14, right? Normally, women in these other Germanic Romano-Germanic countries were to be always under there was a title holder of their juridical persons, in a sense. They could even arrange for their own marriages by age 20, right? And this is an important indicator of a society that was evidently very different already from the one of the North, and presented certain features of dynamism, of greater individual freedom. What we were saying before, it was a higher per capita wealth compared to the North. And there was also an important ecclesiastical presence in the country. By the 11th century, this would be open to the Cluniac reform and being invested in this broader process of instances of, in fact, of reformation, spiritual, reform of the church. Bishop Isarn, helped by Pope Gregory VII, worked consistently to carry out the reform, right? And there were jealousies and struggles in this regard, because other bishops, abbots were, as factually lords in their own possessions, and they didn't hear this could give birth to jealousies, to horror, and the world situation here was importantly fragmented, right? There wasn't quite an hegemonic feudal landlord that could recompose everything unitarily, but still this fragmentation helped to consolidate, even on a more capillary basis, this local development, because there were hospitals being built, basilicas. There's properly material wealth that is taking shape properly from an architectonic, urbanistic point of view. Also, the papacy, as we've seen, intervened. Also, Pope Urban II, when on the First Crusade, gave some permissions to build a basilica to the local Saint Raymond, supported by the Count of Toulouse, Guillaume de Fort, right? And there is a spiritual ferment in Toulouse specifically, right? That goes in parallel with a broader expansion, right? Better, the expansion of agriculture properly, of trade, of traffics, population growth. In fact, the suburbs of Saint-Michel and Saint-Cyprien were built during this period. In Toulouse, also the Dorade Bridge connected in 1181 the Saint-Cyprien suburb to the gates of the city. That naturally were, this is the story I've seen it, the expansion of medieval cities. There's this Roman city wall, and then eventually, population grows around the suburbs out of the city, and this start becoming gentrified. The city kind of incorporates further these areas, they're controlling them. This all takes a government and an administration, literacy, lawyers, councils, assembly, representative assemblies, and so on, right? And the county of Toulouse also participates internationally to the great novelty of the time. That is the Crusade, right? Count Raymond IV, famously enough, left for the Crusade, right? And there were also struggles locally, because there were succession wars that brought to several sieges of the city. In 1119, the population of Toulouse proclaimed Alphonse Jourdain as Count of Toulouse, and Alphonse, in this sense, reduced taxes, especially on salt and wine, so that he got his title like that. So that you understand already that the local communities were strong enough, powerful enough to even to dictate the counts now what they had to do, right? So this is it's part of an integrated government that takes on a communal character, right? More or less, we've talked a lot about Italian communes, but in southern France, basically you have the most similar thing to it. Not exactly the same development, but we know that from the mid-12th century, for example, the people of Toulouse have gotten rid of most of the communal dues, right? The ones that they thought to be more oppressive, right? Because the count represented the feudal authority of the land, right? But these other communities would organize themselves autonomously to and requiring more representative rights in front of the feudal order, and the count had to deal with this, right? In fact, at the death of the count, there was a council of capitulaires that were created, right? And fundamentally, they cooperated with the count with the responsibility of regulating the traffics, making sure that justice was, carried out, because that was normally a public prerogative of the counts on behalf of the king, and yet, as we've seen, not things were not so smooth. There were always troubles, and therefore this community required, mostly as this kind of merchant ethos of the cities, that especially peace existed so that trade could proceed without too much problems, because normally it was the military class, the feudal one, the knights, that lived in a mob-like fashion with very violent customs, also engulfing the city into disruptive battles, urban battles, etc., that would shut down the shops, the production, the activity. So it was important to pacify. In a reality, it was naturally waking up, right, from the the half sleep of the early Middle Ages into where individual lords, individual clientele. Here now things were becoming larger by scale. They needed something more centralized to be organized, and it's beautiful in this picture that this started from a city, from Toulouse itself. In fact, this new magistratures that were created were the ones of the so-called Capitouls that appear first in 1152, when there is trace of the Commune Concilium Tolose, so the Common Council of Toulouse, making police ordinances in its own name, quote, with the advice of Lord Raymond, Count of Toulouse, Duke of Narbonne, and Marquis of Provence, right? So that specifically it was, you see, a nominal integration of comital power in this, a recognition properly of comital power within this autonomous city councils. At this point, this act was witnessed by 6 capitulari, as they were called, 4 duly appointed judges, the judices constituti, as it's written in the source, it would be constitutive rather, and 2 advocates. Right, so we find men of law, right, men of letter, administrators, people carry out justice, right? So there is an important civil administrative development. And 23 years later, in fact, there were 12 capitulari, or consuls, right? 6 for the city, 6 for the suburbs. That also manifests the expansion of the city as a consequence. And that were involved into the major political issues of government, right? In 1176, the chapitre already had 12 members, right, that represented each a district of the city or a suburb. And the consuls also stood against Count Raymond V, for example. There were splits within the city because naturally it was never a unanimous thing. One suburb, one part of the city, suburbs would go against the others, etc. It's the same factionalism we have seen for the Italian city-states. It's emerging more or less in the same times. Italy had more advanced, properly, political and administrative structures at that point. Here you see still the presence of the count, right? So you understand the hybrid, right, between let's say France and Italy in this sense of Occitania in the process, right? And in 1189, however, finally, the City Council of Toulouse obtained the submission of the count, which is a big deal. Because the guy is still there, institutionally recognized, it provides some legitimacy even in the government. It's used to, right? It's not a scapegoat, but it's still somebody who can say, this is technically a count. There's a count, right? So yeah, let's use it to legitimize our own actions. It's important. The same thing that Italian city-states did with bishops. They effectively removed them from the public administration of the city, but they were still acting on behalf of them. Right, because those were the counts of the Italian kingdom since Ottonian times. So you see how many parallelisms. And in 1190, there is the construction of the future common house of Toulouse, the Capitouls, that sees the proper birth of the city council headquarters. Right, so this had 24 members. The Capitouls, as it's called, that dealt with police, trade, also war, of course, because the city would act as, they would have its own militia at its own level, and flanked by its own knights that also had important intersections with the surrounding district and countryside and so on. And there is a successful military history of Toulouse in this period, as a matter of fact. There is that municipal pride of such, stemming from such domination of the surrounding. There is the Latin expression patria Tolosana, so the Toulousan fatherland, right? And this is the military character is crucial in the organization of communal governments, right? Always remember this, that when we talk about the communes, we see it, legally speaking, that the criterion is belonging to the exercitus, belonging to the army, being able to wage war in an organized fashion. These cities are rich, right? We made a video on the wealth of communal infantry, why these areas were so well organized, also logistically in supply, because the city had it wasn't just a rural area with castles, with lords that just had horses, their armor, a retinue, the arms and armor, their retinue, and more or less. These were cities. They were properly. They were the centers where all the components, the tools, the same weapon were the same, but all what it needed to move an army on a large scale, logistically, with supplies, was produced effectively. Wealth was accumulated there, stored there, was protected by city walls, right? So the capitals also lived on historically in the Ancien Regime, even after the Capetian conquest, up to the French Revolution, right? With the creation of the nation state that became the single source of law. So these assemblies lost kind of their progress, but they this is a testament to the importance of the political institutional and administrative level. In fact, even after the conquest of the County of Toulouse from the French, still the city maintained a certain independence, right, and remained a center of the district of Languedoc. Was an important asset for the same French crown. By 1222, the number of capitulari was increased to 24. So there's an extension of civil rights and property, because that's how it goes in parallel. So the community is larger. This is in this point. There's a broader development economically that all Europe is witnessing at this point. By the 13th century, it's a bit the apex, right? But this is exactly why also other powers are expanding, consolidating, and becoming more powerful, and the politically fragmented and economically rich South becomes the best target, understandably. So we made videos about the Albigensian Crusade, always in general, never quite in detail, not even about properly the political and military story of the Crusade. So we'll do it another time. But you know that fundamentally the County of Toulouse is a bit the protagonist from the side of... there is not really a side, meaning that the Albigensian Crusade is something very complex, actually. There was not properly a country like against another, right? There could have been specific... let's say allegiances, policies against the so-called heretics, the so-called Cathars. That is also another very complicated issue. Who were the Cathars, right? Because historiography at this point has quite a certain that there were surely beliefs, quite heterodox beliefs in southern France at this point. They surely rode the wave of autonomism, of anti-Roman and anti-French instances, etc. But who is the Cathar? Like, it's not clear from the sources. That it was mostly a label attached to whoever existed in this broader sense. We wouldn't take action against the heretics because maybe those made the advantage of the local ruler, all these things. So Catharism, is essentially a dual doctrine. So stressing the separation of matter, evil, and the spirit, good, right? And it is it's a Gnostic belief fundamentally that survived throughout the millennia, mostly as a fringe belief. that at this point had probably developed in other areas, passing from the Balkans and spreading into northern Italy, into the Rhineland, in fact, also southern France. But it was this is the great center of the heretics. Actually, the so-called Cathars were around since a long time, right? They didn't appear like at the moment shortly before the Crusade. It was already 200 years going on. And Innocent III, that was consistently the most powerful pope in relative terms in the history, of the Roman Church, as at that point that was the peak of papal power in Europe. Basically, almost every Western Christian country was a vassal of the papacy at that point. Thought better to repress this movement after reiterated appeals. With this evident trend that had taken, that is to say, not just the backing of heterodox ideas such as the denial of incarnation, so the dismissal of the cross as evil matter, right? So these are all theological matters that, of course, you understand after. Essentially, you see, the West had remained fundamentally orthodox throughout all the early Middle Ages. The main heterodox heretic problems had basically been a matter of the Byzantine Empire, also for political reasons. So the West starts witnessing these heresies mostly by the 12th century, already before, right? It's difficult to say, also their survival, their tradition, because as we've seen, they were older than this. But the important thing is that Occitania, broadly meant at this point, was trying essentially to develop an autonomization from the Church of Rome that had consistently nothing to do with any idea of freedom of thought, because at the time there is no such thing like freedom of thought. These are Christians that are, as, let's say, the Cathars were as, discriminatory, like oppressive as, let's say, they had their own inquisition, right? They did the same exact things that the Roman Church did. In fact, they took it as a model of papal monarchy to recreate in their own lands. They were trying to escape the consolidation of Capetian power, was knocking at the door and saying, look, this in theory is our land, right? What are we going to do about it? Of course, the Occitanes resist, and they condensate, in fact, this kind of heterodox belief against the main orthodox axis that was being formed in Europe between Paris and Rome at that point. A very important moment of consolidation, both of the French monarchy and of the papal monarchy. There was a huge work of civilization behind this, because at this point there is no such thing like a generalized authority. Like the church or certain kingdoms began to build it literally from scratch in cooperation with great effort. The 12th century mostly is the great century of heresies. Western Christendom consistently risked at that point, right? It's realistic that if the papacy hadn't existed in the way we know it since the Gregorian reform, there wouldn't properly been the means to stem such heresies, and this is not really a good thing. Again, this has nothing to do with the Enlightenment, liberal, modernistic, anti-clerical perspective that is, at this point, I don't know why even obsessively insisted on by the average person, that there's absolutely nothing to do with free thought. Again, heresies were often dramatically more violent, first of all, because it's not even about religion in itself, it's about broader political and social instances, right? It's mostly a fight against the rich, it's mostly a fight against the elites, it's against these are terrible moments in many ways, also politically, militarily. Great development means also great imbalance, right? The Cathars also had this kind of schizophrenic, like, problematic from a psychological point of view background, for which they reject material wealth exactly in a country that had accumulated so much wealth. So so much wealth that historically I've never seen before, like the 12th century, the 13th century. There are communities in Europe that, from hundreds or millennial years of misery by those standards, began to accumulate an incredible amount of wealth to trade, etc. And new elites form, new interests. So this has basically nothing to do with any freedom of thought, because these heresies were absolutely going in line with the main idea of the time. It is to say, either you obey to this, or I will take you out. Because again, let's stress it, the Cathars had Inquisition. They killed, they persecuted, they did the same exact things that the church is accused of doing, in an obscurantistic fashion. That is exactly what any other power at the time did, because without that you can't really even hope for a civil development to occur in the first place. And in fact, in a general perspective, I explain it in those videos on the thing. There would be so much to tell about this story, that for us it's about the genocide of the Cathars. It wasn't quite, if you call that a genocide, basically you can call a genocide much everybody else, aside from the deep political implications, not just in the usage of the term, but also in the contextual reality we're talking about, where literally religion was in many ways the last of the problems. Many of the so-called Cathars were actually good Orthodox Christians. They had nothing to do with the heterodoxy of it, but it would take arms for other reasons, right? Also, if you resist an authority. Because here, again, it wasn't like in the 19th century, like a country against another country. It was something much more intersected, right? What happened is that Catharism had reached Toulouse. Of course, it was this white brotherhood, especially, that pursued the heretical blacks in the streets of the city. So what happened is the Abbot of Fulk took advantage of this, and claiming that the heretics were his creditors, and encouraged Inquisition in the process. So some joined the whites. Others chose to actually stand from the side of the population that was besieged at that point for this choice. And the councils of Toulouse didn't want, of course, as we've seen before, anything of this mess to happen. Because, as we've seen, they had pushed mostly for pacification, for everything running smoothly and so on. So the problem is that the Pope was asking for them to identify the heretics, and this would bring a split in the local community, because those were there, but still the city didn't want to recognize it. So Raymond VI, Count of Toulouse, who was a Catholic and was excommunicated because he had quarreled with the Pope, later sided with the heretics, right? And because he essentially was contrary to the crusade in itself, right? Especially after the extermination of Béziers that had happened, as many other massacres in this story. And naturally, the truth, the crude reality behind this is that there were enormous interests also from the Kingdom of France to expand at that point, but also to get rid of all these violent vassals of the north that wanted just to participate to the war against England, but taking their own share. So basically, the King of France, Philip II, that not by chance created what we call as France, passing from the Western Frankish Kingdom to nothing changed, but ideologically he was, Philip II Augustus for a reason, thought well to say, okay, go fight in the south, because look what we decided with the Pope, that you can't take all the land. All the land that you take it from the heretics, you can keep your own. So basically he got these guys all away as troublemakers that he just sent them in Occitania. He kept fighting the English with mercenary forces that were much more reliable than vassals by certain standards, and he, as you know, scored this dramatic results of reconquering most of essentially the English. The English controlled through all the feudal issue of the Dutch of Normandy and the creation of the Kingdom of England and so on. From France, the Battle of Bouvines, we made a video about that. Debatably, the most important battle of the Middle Ages, at least for its political consequences in so many countries. And the struggle went on dramatically. Toulouse was besieged thrice, right? In 1211, there had been the first siege in 1213. Simon de Montfort was the head of the Crusaders, defeated the Tolosan army and managed to take the city under the threat of killing many of the hostages. Right, he appointed himself Count of Toulouse, right, in 1216. But he was killed at the third siege of Toulouse that had escaped his control again 2 years later, famously killed by a mangonel stone operated by women, but they were from the city walls of Toulouse. Until the last siege, actually, the White Brotherhood was fought against by the Toulouse populace, right? Eventually, the kingdom. So, because initially the crusade was successful, then eventually, with the death of Simon de Montfort, it's as if all this prolonged struggle had lasted decades. It had, basically was reversed, because he lost everything the Crusaders had. With his death, the whole dominion he had evaporated, and things apparently turned like before. But actually, it was a major blow against the region altogether. There were atrocious, as we've seen, extermination, massacres, sieges. So most of the resources were drawn also from locally, right? It was kind of a civil war within Aquitaine itself. So King Louis VII of France essentially decided to give up in 1219. Raymond VI recognized the support he had received from the population, helping him to preserve his interests and give up his last prerogatives to the Capitouls, that at this point were essentially the leading government of the city. So, in the Treaty of Paris of 1229, Toulouse formally submitted to the crown of France, and the reason being that it was evident that that point, but with the sheer imbalance of power, especially at that point, the French had secured great part of the land, right? So the whole country, and there was really nothing that a city could do against an entire, basically the strongest kingdom in Europe, right? So the Countess sole heiress Joan was engaged to Alphonse, who was Count of Poitiers, and there was a younger brother of Louis IX of France. And the marriage was legalized in 1241. It remained childless, so that at that point, the Count of Toulouse fell to the crown of France by inheritance, right? And this was a big change for many reasons, because essentially the French opened at that point, they occupied the city, they occupied the area, they opened, literally, finally, the control on the Mediterranean, right? Because, as we've seen also in other videos, the southeast of Provence was technically part of the Holy Roman Empire, so this was effectively, with the Count of Toulouse as the major power in the area, the last obstacle for opening the French kingdom to the sea and launching crusades with Saint Louis IX. They also died in them, but Aigues-Mortes was created as a major port for the crusading fleet, for gathering. So beautiful places to visit. By the way, there are so many beautiful, like all the castles around Aquitaine. But I don't know, think about Carcassonne. Yes, it's been rebuilt like most things in France, medieval, in the 19th century actually. Think about Viollet-le-Duc, etc. But it's still you can perceive the intertwinement of this two, of the Languedoc, of this idea of almost essentially an occupation, but also the consolidation of a greater power, right? So to this we stop the story of the Count of Toulouse, because effectively becomes just one of the dependencies of the Crown of France, and it's fit in the broader political control of the same, action of the same. But we made a video about, for example, the juridical tradition. In 1229, the University of Toulouse was established, became an important juridical center more than Paris, albeit it was copied on its own model. Right, it took an important lot from probably the Bolognese Glossa tradition, kind of elaborated it at the point that some Italians also began to take the Toulousan model to apply it in their own Bolognese school. The main goal, however, was also stressing the orthodoxy, right, of the local community. Right, properly studies in theologies were aimed at dissolving the relics of Catharism that had fundamentally disappeared as a political reality, right? But still would live on, right? There are so many traces of this in southern France, in the local traditions and practice. This naturally, it's not like Catharism just itself, but it's intertwined with the broader also pagan past of Europe, some certain local traditions, all in a Christianized reality, of course. The same Catharism was Christianity according to them, but they fundamentally, at this point, there is no consistent change. Orthodoxy triumphs, and also this is the moment of the great mendicant order push that had a dramatic development. The Dominicans, the Franciscans, exactly to count, especially the Dominicans, as you know, that from the same area, from the same Spain, had, think about Domingo of Guzman, and that's how the whole thing started. It was started in an anti-Cathar function, right, properly to debate these people from an intellectual point of view, and the development of orders being properly, in a sense, a militarized one in terms of discipline, but also properly of education, so that these guys would become the top educators in late medieval Europe later on. Well, Toulouse as a center catalyzes this dynamics, because it's where, especially in this city, because the Catharism had spread in most the dangerous heresies in the most developed areas in Europe, as we were saying before, northern Italy, the Rhineland, the southern France, right? So certain areas that were really active, especially from an economical point of view, had strong middle classes, merchants, etc., that leave this, as we've seen, this tension, right, with the problems with how to reconcile wealth with salvation, all these things, and that's had the rejection of materialism, and part of the broader spirit that Catharism was infesting with, but there was an answer to this. This is the same century of scholastics and how everything had to fit in, a great work of integration of Aristotelian scientific and non-Neoplatonic to properly consolidate a scientific vision against the one of Gnosticism that was saying pretty physical and metaphysical things that had to be countered on that level, right? And Inquisition also went on like for a very long time, right? There were naturally lots of conversions. There were also lots of exiles, for that matter. Some wouldn't accept the new order, but this was to stay in a constructive sense. And also Count Raymond VII was convicted of heresy and died in 1249 without a hair. As we've seen, the Toulouse county was then given to a king of France that would rule it with seneschals, right? That were properly the men of the king, of a monarchy that was also there surpassing kind of just the feudal administration and getting to something more centralized, to specific appointees and people that had to have an education, juridical practice, hence the importance of the university also in the center, not just in Paris but in the south. So it was a way to export part of that hierarchy, that structure, that order from the north to the south. I was asked recently, and that's why I made the video today actually, is why don't you talk about a bit Aquitainian? Naturally, and the question also included, why don't you talk about the troubadour, right, and the broader artistic development of this case of old Occitan lyric poetry, right? But there would be that from the spread eventually is far and wide, with the Minnesang in Germany, or even up to Dante, in Italy. So they had such a great impact in through different ways, fueling the Sicilian school, right? So some of the top, artistic contents, the pillar, the roots of Western civilization. It started from there, yes, and maybe we'll make a video about this. Recently I made on demand another small video on the sonnet that takes into consideration part of this Provençal legacy, mostly, actually, most Provençal then, but still, existing in this broader arc, southern Gaul, broadly meant, in this intensity, as we've seen, rich, urbanized area that produced so much also culturally and artistically. In 1323, there was the establishment of the Consistori del Gai Saber, that was essentially a poetic academy founded to perpetuate the lyric poetry of the troubadour, right? And thus, Toulouse became the center of Occitan literary culture for roughly, another century, right? The Consistori was last active in the 80s of the 15th century. So you understand its prestige, also in a sense of a slowly dying culture. The land was very rich, as we were saying before. Toulouse, even under the Capetians, didn't stop growing. It mostly exported wine, Bordeaux wine, with England through, in fact, the Atlantic watershed on the other side. But it produced also important agricultural goods, textiles. There were industries in the city. And eventually, the broader areas, would receive a dramatic blow, mostly during the 100 Years' War, right? This decimated Toulouse. There were many other issues, like including the Black Death, right? Floods, devastations, but mostly it's the great English chevauchée that lay waste basically this, and especially the south of France, because that was far of the reach of the north, and at that point was struggling for survival itself, says you can't really do anything. So this enormous cavalcades through this very rich, advanced Occitanian countryside would be utterly laid waste, destroyed, the suburbs of the cities set on fire, like the most atrocious violence you can imagine. And it's been estimated on that occasion the population fell of 10,000 inhabitants in 70 years between kills, emigrants, etc. And by 1405, the city had only 22,000 inhabitants. So you understand, here we are in front of a fascinating reality that, in a broader perspective, didn't quite take off as a feudal power. I think it's crucial in the broader vision, because the County of Toulouse was prosper, powerful, as we've seen it, even, famously enough, they participated to the First Crusade. They were an important reality, but at the same time, differently, I think about the Duchy of Burgundy, about which I made a video recently, that, it's properly the lack of a feudal power here that makes of this reality something more static, more passive. As we've seen, the County of Toulouse power is eroded fundamentally by the commune created in the city, and this is it's as if it was almost a city-state, right? Almost, though, because there was never quite the full prevalence of the commune, if not at the very end of the of the county's independence, right? And still counts were there, and they were invested in the military tasks, etc. So it was always an ambiguity that, in a broader sense, didn't develop much of a consistent territorial power. The Council of Toulouse essentially had, as at the head of the district of feudal origin, the control all over the territory, right? But factually, there would be other dynasties within the same territory, also infiltrating from the outside, the power of the city growing. So actually what the counts controlled at the height of their power was something like just the city, if they were lucky, not being ousted from it, and some other center, some other land around it, right? So this is, albeit in spite of the wealth, the opulence, etc., it doesn't quite produce something that goes beyond even the military importance of the city, even the let's say this activity, this sense of themselves, etc., doesn't quite go as far as saying, okay, this goes beyond into like an expansion into another region. Instead, no, right? And actually, the more likely to have done such a thing were feudal dynasties that had, feudal because they were consistently developing a very efficient system. The Duchy of Burgundy is a bit the extreme because that's literally one of the most advanced realities ever created within a vassalatic power, and still what was still essentially the same royal Capetian lineage. Here, it's really different, right? It shows you how a political disunion, in a sense, a lack of a cohesion, brings to an intrinsic vulnerability, right? And this land didn't evolve into something else. We speak of the County of Toulouse. We could speak, I don't know, of the Duchy of Brittany or the Duchy of Burgundy, let's say, as powers that, well, the Duchy of Burgundy eventually evolved in the Burgundian state. That's what I meant with the comparison before, but never, taking kind of another part, like not another country that is effectively cohese against another, right? If they had to conquer, I don't know, another land that was affected, I don't know, think about even Flanders, right? Flanders also doesn't make it to take, like, it's backed by other powerful, like by England, for example. Here there are not great powers around, because from one side you have Spain that, as we've seen, the Crown of Aragon especially was kind of fragmented into their own. The Basque powers also weren't like that. From the north you have this consistent French kingdom, and then from another side you have the sea, and then in Provence also there is properly nothing like fully centralized. So they're a bit isolated in practice, and they don't turn this into something more like aggressive, right? In spite, because I believe that compared to the resources available, something more could have been done, but probably not enough to escape on the long run the Western Frankish push. But I don't know, if the French had been defeated at Bouvines, we would have lived in a completely different story. Who knows? Maybe this reality would have emerged as something more something stronger, right? Anyhow, for now, we stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.